Hey there, check out Volume 1 of the ADNA Presents, only available on Kindle. Welcome to the ADNA Presents. Today we're very happy to have Brian Gebhart join us. He is the description manager at Caption Max. Thanks for joining
Thanks for
us.
having me. It's great to be here.
What do you love about audio description?
Well, I love language and I love telling stories. So those are the things that really kind of drew me into audio description in the first place. You know, I went to grad school for creative writing. And so when I finished, I was just kind of looking for a job where I could use my skills and do something related to writing, related to language. And I saw a job posting that just was headlined, "Word Nerd Needed." And I thought, well, whatever that is, I can do it probably. That drew me in. And I actually started as a caption editor, Caption Max. And then almost exactly 10 years ago, the CVAA had just been passed. So we were expecting more volume in audio description. And so I was kind of recruited into the description department. So yeah, at first, I just really loved being a part of telling stories, being able to provide a service, you kind of use my skills to help provide a service that brings people such delight. And that's something that really kind of hit home to me probably 6 or 7 years ago. We've got an advisory board of people who are blind or teachers of the blind. And we did a screening of a movie that we described one year. And one of our board members is a teacher. And so she brought several of her students there to the screening. And so we watched the movie. And then after it was over, she came up to me and said, "Hey, I've got a couple of my students here and they just wanted to talk to you." I had written the script for the movie. And so I went over. There's a few kids, 13, 14 years old. And one of them said, and this was her first experience with watching a movie that had been described. And she was just raving about how, this is the best movie she'd ever seen. And so, I definitely walked out of that room on a cloud. And I think I try to keep that in mind, in the day-to-day hustle and bustle and of deadlines and getting work done and everything, that ultimately what we're doing is we're helping people experience these stories in a way that maybe at times, they haven't been able to experience them previously. I love being a part of that. I love being a part of a team, of creative people who all are working together on a project. Any part of movie making or making any kind of video production, TV production, it all involves a huge team, obviously. And we're one part of that. But I think one thing that's cool about audio description is, it's a smaller team. Maybe there's just 4 or 5 people who end up working on one project. But the people in the audio description team, for our audience, for the audience of people who are blind or low vision who use audio description, we get to have a really big impact on how they experience that media, that film, that TV show. And so when we do a good job, it really kind of feels good that, hey, I've helped provide this experience to somebody who's really kind of seeking it out. So yeah, those are all the things that I just on first brush really love about audio description.
And something that came up 2 times in what you shared was the word creative, that it came in the context of your experience as a creative writer, the word nerd example, and also the team coming together creatively.
Mhm.
I find that there's a lot of misunderstandings in people who are relatively new to audio description or might not even hear about it before, that you also use the word service. And I'd like to kind of put those 2 words up against each other, service and creative, that when it comes to the creative contribution that you and your team are doing, you mentioned good job, that there seems to be a misunderstanding in people relatively new to audio description or maybe absolutely new to it, that it is this, oh, let's check the box and we'll provide the audio description.
Mhm.
And it's almost shrugged off. And the way that you're talking about audio description with the creativity, the word nerdism, is that there's a lot more to it. Could you go into a little bit about that misconception of let's say the creative or the artistic side when it's put up against the bare minimum?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is we're sort of translating the visual into words. The visual made verbal is, Joel Snyder's phrase is one way to put it, but we're not creating the content itself. but the process of making it accessible, the process of translating the visuals into words that then become audio, that then get integrated into the soundtrack, that I think has to be a creative process, choosing the exact right words to bring a moment to life. One thing we kind of deal with as a team of writers is, how do you mix up the language? You've got characters who are always doing similar things. They're always walking, or they're always looking. Sometimes they're just walking, but maybe they're striding, or maybe they're sauntering, or, maybe they're sashaying, or whatever you want to put in there. Picking the right word to really bring it to life, I think, is really critical. And the same holds true for the voiceover aspect. It would be much easier to go into a recording booth and just give the same read to every line, right? You could do it faster, it would be simpler, but helping to kind of place the audience in the scene, in the moment, is something that's really critical in both the writing and the voiceover aspect of the service. And so I think it's a bit of an older model or guideline of, oh, just stick to the facts, just say the simplest, most objective thing you can say. But whenever I've listened to what audiences actually have to say, or talk to people who are blind and low vision who really love description, most of the times, there's some people prefer a more minimalist style, some people prefer a bit more, but almost everybody wants to feel like the description is part of the media itself, part of the whole experience. So yeah, I think that's where the creativity comes in, is trying to kind of merge everything into this one kind of seamless experience.
And in that context, that audience immersion, we talk a lot about that in all our podcasts with all the professionals that contribute to audio description, that feeling that you're talking about. I'm trying to think about how to approach this from an audience's experience, that when they're in good hands with audio description, you've mentioned the writing, there's the mix, how loud or soft, there's the timing, there's the voice talent. I'm assuming there's also quality control, and there's direction, and that all these elements, and one person could fill many different roles of those different elements, the whole team aspect. I'm wondering about that assumption that people have, oh, you're just taking what's happening on screen and putting it to words. It's really clear, just how you've answered these questions so far, that it's so much more involved with that. Just the way you talked about how walking can have so many different nuances and perspectives. Could you talk a little bit about that? Let's say it's a toggle effect. It's either on or off. You either have it or you don't. But
Right.
you're really going into the detail here, and I think it's giving our audience that, when you say place the audience in the moment, there's a lot more that goes into it, a lot more thought, a lot of passion, your creative writing enhancements. Could you talk a little more about what that means as far as what output you put out there with Caption Max?
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple other aspects that are also really important, like the mix, like the timing. The timing is an interesting one, where there's often this debate of, well, if there's some big thing that's going to happen, there's a big reveal, or there's an explosion, or there's something that maybe it's an auditory thing, so the audience will hear it, but the source of that big event might not be clear. So we have to, as describers, we have to clarify it somehow. And figuring out the timing to get the description as close as possible to that sound effect, so that we don't spoil it, right? We don't want to announce, and the building explodes, and then 10 seconds go by, and then we hear the sound effect, right? So trying to get that right there. And even in many cases, what we try to do is set up the description, set up, the car veers off the road or something, and then you hear the sound of a crash, and then you describe the after effects of it, so that you're kind of in line, and so that the experience of audience members who are using the description will align with the experience of sighted audiences too.
That's really well said. I've not heard that set up with After Effects so clearly stated. That's really great. And that immersion that you're talking about continues with that experience being simultaneous. I was wondering if we could go back to the advisory board. A lot of our blind professional talents have been contributing to this work. Audio description was created by blind people for blind people, and that you mentioned that that's part of your system, your process, your company. Can you tell about the contribution the advisory board has made to quality audio description?
Sure. It's something that originated at the very beginning of our department when we first started audio description. Most of the description work we did in the early years, this was about 20 years ago, and before I was even with the company, started through a Department of Education grant program. So we were doing a lot of educational content, a lot of kids programming. And so started the Consumer Advisory Board as part of that. But then it just kind of developed from there. And we keep in touch with them as often as possible. Some of the best experiences I had early in my career as a describer were going to our annual advisory board meetings where we'd gather people together. We'd do a movie screening and talk about the movie. And then we'd just kind of sit down and do kind of focus group type things where we'd play some clips and say, here's this situation, and here's how we decided to handle it. What do you think about that? Or what could we have done better? How would you prefer that to have been handled? So yeah, those were really valuable experiences, I think, for me, for other members of our team. And it's something that we're still looking for ways to do that better, ways to keep engaging with our audience. We've had a couple of internships we've done in the past where we brought in people who are blind and who love audio description and just sat them down for some time and had them listen to some of the work we're doing, collaborate on some of our scripts, and gotten their feedback on, what's working and what's not. And so that's really kind of helped inform some of the directions that we've taken over the past several years.
Great to hear about that consumer focus of making sure that they're getting what they want. And obviously there's a window there for including the professionals who are blind, who do the work of either writing or voice talent or professional quality control on that side for for making sure that their value is a part of that. Is that also a part of the system, or is that coming soon?
That's something that we do need to do more work on. And I think that's definitely in the plans for the future. So yeah, I'll just say that that's something I've been talking about with other folks on the team for the last couple of years.
Great to hear it. And let's go back to what you said about being a part of the story. I'm wondering about the integration with production. This is probably bigger than Caption Max, I'd imagine. But from your experience, when it comes to production or even post production, the work is created. Let's say a film or a TV series, streaming series, is created, and then historically that gets handed off to maybe a distributor, and then the distributor maybe hands it off to you. Do you see an opportunity for integrating with production or post production before the distributor? In other words, would it be helpful? And this is such a leading question, Brian. This is so unfair. Would it be helpful if you were to have that information, that content earlier for both the timing and maybe the creative contribution of the actual production?
Yeah, I think that's something we've been able to do on a couple of occasions. We had one independent filmmaker come to us probably about 5 years ago, reach out and wanted to get description done. I'll go ahead and plug the movie because it's a good movie, an interesting one. Is an arts documentary called Shoulder the Lion. And it was focused on three people: a musician who was losing his hearing, a photographer who was losing her sight, and then a visual artist who had experienced a traumatic brain injury and lost some cognitive function. So anyway, as part of the process of working with the filmmaker, she wanted to see our script before we recorded and get script approval. She was very interested in knowing how we were going to describe certain scenes and certain situations. And it was a very impressionistic sort of film where there would be images that were sort of evocative of the emotions or the struggles that the characters were going through, what they were experiencing. And so I sent her a draft of the script, and she came back with a lot of notes, and we were able to kind of collaborate back and forth and work through some of those. And it was an interesting process because in some cases she had a very kind of specific meaning in her mind as the filmmaker to a certain shot or to a certain sequence and what that was intended to communicate. And there were times when as a describer, I was saying, well, I'm just communicating the visual, what it looks like. And so that was interesting, trying to align our interests there. There were ways in which she kind of wanted to communicate, well, here's what this means. And I was saying, well, I get that. Is there a way we can meet in the middle somewhere to where I'm not directly saying, here's this thing, then here's what it means, but I'm saying like, here's this thing and it kind of looks like X, Y, or Z. So that was a really fascinating process. Yeah. So I think to the extent that there are people in production who are interested and who want to make their creations more accessible, getting describers involved in the process earlier is definitely a great thing to do. Even if it's just sending us materials, scripts, rough cuts, just so that we have more time and more running room to get up to speed, to do our research, to make sure we're getting all the names and locations right and everything like that. But yeah, obviously, in the long term, timing is such an important issue as a writer, and figuring out how to fit descriptions into little tight spaces between dialogue where you've got 2 seconds, but there may be something big happening. Those can be fun challenges, but it also leaves me thinking, man, I wish there's just a little bit more time here, a little bit more, break in the dialogue to where I could get something else in.
It's a great example of that pain that time can be, or limited time can be, in both, the actual experience for the audience as well as, you creating it. You mentioned that being a challenge. Are there any other challenges that you've faced as a company, or you personally within the company, that you'd like to share? Maybe you were proud of how you overcame it.
Well, I think a majority of our work is in television, TV series, in large part. And so working with those production timelines can be difficult. We often work on projects where, we may not see the absolute final version until the day before it has to be delivered. We may be delivering our file the day before it goes to air. So that's challenging. Definitely getting some of those materials, the rough cut and the script ahead of time helps. We've also worked out processes where we will often write the entire script and even sometimes record all the voiceover based on whatever we have available. And then when we finally get the final version, we'll do our final QC checks. And it often does mean we have to do rescripts, retakes. If there are kind of last minute changes to the timing or last minute changes to like the visual effects, we sometimes are working with temporary effects where there's a green screen. And so if we have the script, we can kind of say, well, it looks like this is what's going to be happening here once those effects are finalized. I have a great team of describers, of narrators, of audio engineers who are really dedicated to what they do. And we work sometimes very early in the morning and very late at night to make sure that we can meet the deadlines while still, making sure we're delivering the best product we can. That's kind of my biggest day-to-day challenge. I also like the fun challenges of one of the favorite questions around the office is, hey, what do you call this thing? Or, hey, how would you describe this? And so those can sometimes lead to really interesting conversations between people. And that's part of what helps keep the job lively and interesting.
So something like she carries the object through the room.
Yeah. What's that object?
Where do you go from there?
Right.
Let's start that as the baseline.
Right.
You would use the word describer, just for our audience's sake. In this context, it sounds like describer is the writer. Sometimes
Right.
that, as a voice talent, I find I'm misconstrued as the describer. I'm like, no, I'm reading a script. Somebody gave it to me. So I'm assuming that that's easy to, in that context, describer is writer.
Yeah.
Very cool. Where would you love to see audio description headed?
Oh, man.
Dream world.
Yeah, right. Well, dream world is that every piece of media is described, right? Seeing where description has come in the past 10 years is pretty astonishing, but there's obviously still a long ways to go. I think helping to fill some of the gaps. So, we're now at the point where most major streaming services offer description for their new and original titles, but filling out the back catalog of stuff is also important. We're at the point where almost all major film releases include description, but Sometimes accessing that in the theater can be a big challenge, or sometimes the technology just isn't working. I think web video is kind of this huge landscape of content. There's just an untold number of hours of video out there that most of it is not described at this point. And so I think that's a big challenge. I think of it in terms of, I have two kids, an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and my 8-year-old loves YouTube. And so do I, in the sense that if we were having a conversation about something, if he has a question, I'm like, well, I don't know, we could probably find a video about this. But inevitably, and sometimes I'll check, but inevitably that video is rarely described. And I think, well, man, if my kid were blind, then that would kind of be a big miss. Or, I mean, I would have to sit here and describe the elements that weren't already. I think we're moving in the right direction, definitely. But I think, yeah, there's this huge amount of video out there that really should be described and can be described. I think making the process as efficient and as easy as possible for creators who might not have the big budgets and might not have all the resources, figuring out ways to make that process, make it visible, make it easy for them to access so that they can provide description. I think that's kind of one of the big next areas where I would like to see it go.
When we think about the streaming companies that have multi-million-dollar budgets per episode, and that scaling down to the guy that's showing how to change a carburetor out of a car, those are two pieces of media, but I'd imagine those are two completely different approaches. Is there a way that you would share? Let's start with audiences, and then maybe with someone who wants to hire you, if we could use those two examples, if this is a fair question. How would you approach that? And again, I'm not looking for insider secrets here. I'm looking for accessibility when it comes to those different kinds of extreme, let's say, budgets.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one obvious thing is, and I know there's been a lot of discussion in audio description aficionado circles about synthesized voiceover, human voiceover. Obviously, I know I'm talking to a voiceover actor right now.
I may be biased, but I can be an open mind.
Yeah.
And by the way, I've got no interest in being anybody's voice for like a Twitter feed or calendar appointments. There's definitely a place for synth voice.
Right.
I didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not all or nothing.
Right. But that's kind of where I was heading, is that, from my standpoint, I always prefer a human voice. And I think almost all audience members do. And I think for entertainment content, for content that is meant to spark emotion, spark thought, and really engage the audience at that level, there really is no substitute for human voice, because a human narrator can capture the nuances of each scene, can adjust their tone and their delivery based on the circumstance, even from word to word in some cases. But I definitely think that, like we're talking about, for this vast amount of video out there that isn't described, that, yeah, there's a place for synthesized voiceover there, where doing it more efficiently, doing it faster, and doing it at higher volumes too. There are big corporations that have libraries of thousands and thousands of videos. And in that sense, it's not even only just a cost question, it's also a volume and a speed question of, if a company wants to describe 20,000 videos, it might take years if you were doing it, human voiceover on everything. If there was a way to do it faster, then I think we should find a way to do it faster to make that content more accessible as quickly as possible.
And it sounds like also that nuance that you shared with about preferring a human voice. I get the content in this context sounds more informational based. It sounds, at least in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, that's kind of how I think of it, and that's what I've heard from audiences too. I follow various discussion groups and talk to people whenever I get a chance. And in general, I feel like most people who use audio description prefer something to nothing. And I think most of them prefer a human voice to a synthesized voice. But if the choice were between something or nothing, I'm confident that in most cases they would choose having something to make the content more accessible. So
in that context, it's also based on the cost, the volume, and the speed that you had mentioned earlier. I think there's a fair argument to say that that question, when it's a major, huge production that's got millions of dollars behind it, that that question being asked, something is better than nothing, isn't it? Feels discriminatory in that
sure.
context, in that very unique
Hmm.
context. That I think what we're talking about is that volume of the big corporations, the educational content that is just informational. I don't want to be wedging anything in here,
Yeah.
but again, I'm so biased. And I see the value that you've put on the voice talent and the nuance and that performance in working with the team, with the writers, with the mixers, the engineers, the editors, that really does make a difference for the experience of our audiences. So thank you for making that really
Yeah.
clear.
And I mean, the other thing I'd add to that is that, this used to never happen, but more often these days, we're getting contact from, the people in a production that we're working with on a TV show or a documentary or something. And they're asking about casting the voice talent. Can you send me samples? What sort of voice do you think is appropriate for this? And granted, it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen a majority of the time, but I'm starting to see more of it. And so, yeah, we'll pull, 3 or 4 voices and say, well, here's kind of some options that we're thinking would work well. Then they'll take a listen and pick one that they like.
Wow, that's great to hear.
Yeah. And to the extent that they're thinking about that and engaging in it, it means that, they're considering the value, they're trying to create the highest quality story, the highest quality media, whatever it is, a film or a TV show or whatever. And in all other aspects of the production, no expense is spared. They're using all this time on the editing and the music and everything. And so I think there's starting to be a realization that audio description should be a part of that conversation too, because there's a big audience out there that wants it, that will be using it, and that may very well turn the movie off or turn the TV show off if the audio description is bad, or if it's not accessible, or if they just don't like it for whatever reason. And so getting them engaged in that discussion at that level, I think, is starting to happen. And I hope it can, keeps happening more.
Oh, that's great. I'd be so happy to end on that, but I have to give you an opportunity to share anything else that we may not have covered yet that you'd love to share with our audience.
I think we covered just about everything that I had in mind. Yeah, this has been great.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. How can we reach you, your company, follow social media, et cetera?
I'm not super active on social media, but I am on LinkedIn. If anyone wants to, they can certainly track me down there. And feel free to go to Caption Max's website, check out what we do. Shoot me an email, Brian Gebhart at captionmax.com. Always happy to talk to people about what we're doing. The more people I talk to, the more excited I get about what we do and about the future too.
Thanks so much for joining us, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun.